Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. João was exhausted. Moving into the old boarding house in the city center had been much more tiring than he had imagined. The sun was setting when he finally closed the door to his new room and took a quick look around. The boarding house, with its peeling walls and faded carpets, seemed like a relic from a better past. He went down the stairs to explore the building and meet the other tenants. The hallway was shrouded in an uncomfortable twilight, with flickering lamps casting unsettling shadows on the walls. João noticed that most of the other residents looked at him strangely, avoiding eye contact and murmuring hurried apologies when he tried to start a conversation. Whispers about the attic began to surface almost immediately. There was something unsettling about that part of the building. One afternoon, as he passed by the attic door, João noticed a detail he hadn't seen before. A rusty chain and a crude padlock prevented access. Curious, he decided to ask the landlord about it. "Oh, the attic," the landlord replied with a tone João couldn't decipher. "It's not a place for normal people. Better left alone." The evasive answer only heightened João's curiosity. Why could a simple room be so forbidden? He started paying attention to the little things. The sound of something scratching on the ceiling at night, the occasional murmur coming from the attic that sounded more like a lament than a normal noise. Every time he passed the locked door, a chill ran down his spine, a feeling that something was wrong, as if the wall itself was hiding a terrible secret. The mystery grew in his mind, fueled by a sense of unease he couldn't ignore. The old building seemed to whisper secrets to him, and the attic, with its locked and hidden door, was the centerpiece of an enigma João was determined to unravel. Days passed, and the presence of the attic became an obsession for João. Every time he passed the locked door, his curiosity grew. The stories he had heard were fragmented, but there was a clear consensus. No one spoke about the attic with any clarity or interest. There was a mystery, and João was determined to discover what lay behind that forbidden door. On a gray, cold afternoon, João decided it was time to investigate further. He looked for a way to talk to the other tenants without seeming intrusive. He tried to befriend the elderly woman who lived on the floor below, a tired-looking woman who was always alone and seemed to carry an invisible burden. "I heard some rumors about the attic," João commented casually, trying to sound uninterested. "They say there's something strange up there." The woman looked at him with a look of fear and unease. Her eyes seemed to fill with a shadow when she mentioned the attic. "Better not mess with it," as she murmured, almost in a whisper. "Some things are better left in the past." Disappointed by the lack of information, João decided he needed to seek more details on his own. Night fell, and the building was enveloped in a chilling calm, as if it were waiting for something. He climbed to the attic floor, where the locked door was always in view, a physical and symbolic barrier against any attempts at curiosity. Armed with a flashlight and a set of tools he found in the landlord's toolbox, which surprisingly was open and within reach, João began to work on the chain and padlock. Every movement he made seemed to echo through the empty hallway, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Finally, with a snap, the chain broke and the padlock opened. João pushed the door open slowly, and the flashlight's beam revealed a dust-covered room, with old furniture draped in white, dusty sheets. The smell of dampness and abandonment lingered in the air. He hesitated for a moment, but the desire to discover what was hidden was stronger. João entered the room and began to explore. There was a large cabinet in the corner, with closed and locked doors. The table in the center of the room was covered with crumpled papers and old objects, some of which had a strangely macabre appearance. The walls were covered with symbols and drawings made with what seemed to be dried blood. As he examined the table, a faint dragging sound began coming from the back of the attic. João stopped immediately, his senses on alert. He looked back at the door, now propped open, and a chill ran down his spine. Something was moving in the dark, something that shouldn't be there. And that sound. It sounded like a whisper, an ancient voice speaking in a language João didn't understand. His heart raced, and he knew he needed to leave, but something held him back. The mystery of the attic was only beginning to reveal itself, and João was about to uncover a secret that had been hidden for a long time. João barely managed to sleep that night. The sight of the attic and the strange objects continued to haunt his thoughts. The next morning, he decided he needed to find out more about the room's past. He went to the local library and delved into research about the building's history. The place had been an old sanatorium over a century ago, and João soon realized there might be buried stories that explained the bizarre behavior of the residents and the mystery of the attic. After hours of research, João found an old, dusty, and poorly preserved sanatorium records book. Flipping through the yellowed pages, he found a chapter that mentioned the building of his boarding house. The narrative was about unauthorized medical experiments and occult practices carried out in secret. The sanatorium had been abruptly closed after a series of mysterious incidents and unexplained deaths. The page that caught João's attention spoke of a group of individuals who supposedly used the attic to perform occult rituals. They were described as a secret cult that believed the attic had supernatural properties that could be manipulated to perform macabre rituals. The book mentioned a series of disturbing incidents, including claims that some patients had disappeared without a trace. João was stunned. The descriptions were horrifying and seemed to align with the symbols he had seen in the room. The idea that the attic was a site of such dark practices made his stomach churn. But what really troubled him was the fact that the cult apparently believed these rituals could open some kind of portal to another dimension. Determined to discover more, João decided to return to the attic. With an increasing sense of dread, he climbed the stairs and braced himself for whatever might be there. The flashlight's beam flickered as he crossed the dust-covered room. The air was even heavier and colder than before, and the feeling of being watched grew with each step. He returned to the closet and began searching more thoroughly. With some difficulty, he managed to force the closet doors open. Inside, he found an old, rusted box. Within the box were additional documents, more diaries, and various ritualistic items. Used candles, strange clay figures, and amulets covered with disturbing symbols. João opened one of the diaries and started reading. The pages were filled with detailed descriptions of the rituals performed in the attic, each one more sinister than the last. The final entry was particularly disturbing, a description of a final ritual that promised to bring an entity from another dimension into this world, a being that was said to have the power to control and terrorize anyone who crossed its path. His heart raced. The idea that these practices might still be occurring, or that the room could be connected to something more sinister, was almost unbearable. João felt a weight in the atmosphere, as if the attic itself were absorbing his curiosity and fear. With a sense of desperation, he stood up and decided to leave the room. However, as he began to head for the door, a loud, muffled sound came from the far end of the attic. It was as if something was moving down there, or something or someone was trying to enter the room. João felt a chill run down his spine and the sensation of being surrounded. He needed to get out before it was too late, before the hidden forces he had uncovered took over his mind and body. João couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Each night in the room was a battle against the growing fear that haunted him. Strange phenomena began soon after his last visit to the attic. Initially, they were just small events, the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway, doors creaking for no apparent reason. But soon, these events intensified. One night, as he was trying to sleep, João heard a soft whisper coming from the attic. He couldn't make out the words, but it was a voice that seemed to murmur in an urgent and desperate tone. Shivering with cold, João got up and went to the attic door, only to find the hallway empty and silent. The whisper ceased as soon as he opened the door, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. In the following days, the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. João could feel a constant presence, an invisible shadow that seemed to follow him. When he tried to focus on his daily tasks, his reflection in the mirror seemed distorted, as if it were contorting into a fearful expression he didn't recognize as his own. Nightmares began to haunt him. Each night, he was transported to the attic, where he saw the macabre rituals described in the diaries unfolding before his eyes. Hooded figures chanted in strange languages, and a dark entity, with glowing eyes and an undefined shape, seemed to watch him from a dark corner of the room. The terror was so real that João would wake up screaming, his body drenched in cold sweat. One day, after a particularly vivid nightmare, João returned to the attic, determined to face his fears. He had found an old book of witchcraft among the ritualistic items and decided he needed to understand what was happening. The room was even colder and more oppressive than usual. The flashlight illuminated the shadows unevenly, casting unsettling shapes on the walls. Opening the book, João found rituals described in detail, with instructions for summoning entities and performing sacrifices. The pages were stained with a dark, thick substance, which João didn't want to think too much about. With growing fear, he continued reading, discovering that the rituals described were designed to open a door to another dimension, allowing entities from a parallel reality to enter this world. As he studied the pages, a sinister sound began echoing in the room, a repetitive thumping, as if something was trying to break the attic door. The sound was increasing in intensity, and João felt a rising panic. He tried to focus, but his mind was in a whirl of terror. Each thump seemed to get closer, and the cold in the air became almost unbearable. Desperate to understand what was happening, João looked at the symbols on the walls and realized they were beginning to glow with a faint, pulsating light. The feeling that something was approaching the door to another dimension grew stronger. He felt a growing pressure in his chest, as if he were being pulled into the attic itself. On impulse, João grabbed the book and tried to close the box containing the ritualistic items. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that made his hair stand on end and his nerves stretch. The sound of the thumping turned into a deafening roar, and João knew he needed to leave before the terror he had awakened went beyond what he could control. He ran for the exit, almost stumbling as the atmosphere around him seemed to twist and distort. The shadows on the walls moved unsettlingly, as if trying to reach him. João left the attic and locked the door behind him, his heart pounding frantically. He knew something terrible was about to happen, and he needed to find a way to escape before it was too late. João couldn't sleep that night. Fear and panic kept him awake, The feeling that something was inevitably approaching consumed him. He knew he couldn't stay in the boarding house any longer. The atmosphere felt charged with oppressive energy, and the attic door seemed to pulse with a threatening presence. The next morning, João decided he had to leave. He started packing his belongings, trying to ignore the feeling that something was about to happen. However, as he packed his things, he noticed something disturbing. The doors and windows of the boarding house seemed to have changed. He tried to leave through the main door, but it was locked with a padlock he had never seen before. His heart raced. He ran through the hallways, trying to open other doors and find an exit. Each corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the paths he knew were now distorted, as if the building itself was reshaping to keep him trapped. Despair set in as he encountered locked doors and endless hallways, all seeming to lead him back to the attic. As he wandered through the building, João heard a familiar voice. It was the voice he had heard in the attic, now amplified and distorted, reverberating through the walls like an endless lament. He followed the sound to the end of the corridor, where he found a door he had never seen before. The door was ajar, and the faint light leaking from inside was almost hypnotic. With a mix of terror and curiosity, João pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was strange and filled with objects he didn't recognize. In the center stood a hooded figure, facing away from him. The figure was in front of an altar covered with lit candles and symbols glowing with a supernatural light. The atmosphere was thick with oppressive heat and a nauseating smell of melted wax. The figure slowly turned around, revealing a face covered by a grotesque mask, with glowing empty eyes that seemed to pierce directly into João. The air grew heavy, and the sense of oppression intensified. The entity made a gesture, and João felt a cold chill run through his body. The altar was covered with images and texts he recognized from the journals, ancient rituals and summoning rites. The entity raised a skeletal hand and pointed at João, as if inviting him to join the ritual. The eyes of the mask glowed intensely, and João felt a wave of panic so strong it nearly made him faint. He tried to move, but his legs were paralyzed with fear. The entity began to murmur words in a strange language, and the room around him began to warp, as if the very space was being torn and reshaped. João saw horrifying visions. Shadows moving erratically, and distorted figures seeming to reach out for him. Desperate to escape, João turned and ran back through the distorted hallways. Every time he thought he was close to the exit, the corridors seemed to change, leading him back to a familiar and disturbing place. The roar of supernatural winds echoed in his ears, and the feeling that something was behind him never faded. Finally, João found a broken window that led outside. Without thinking, he jumped out, landing heavily on the ground. The fresh night air felt like a temporary relief, but the building continued to twist and distort behind him, as if trying to keep him inside. With sore feet and a still racing heart, João began to run away from the boarding house. Each step felt harder than the last, but the urge to escape and the feeling of being pursued pushed him forward. He knew he had faced something beyond any logical explanation, and that the boarding house would continue to haunt those who entered its domain. Looking back one last time, João saw the silhouette of the building fading into the darkness, a sinister presence that seemed to promise that the terror would continue, even without him. He had escaped, but the weight of what he had experienced continued to haunt him, an eternal reminder of the horrors he had uncovered.